they haven't been capable of really being that different level of contender. They've settled into a plateau. And a few years ago, I would have said, okay, you have to understand that part of that was done as they were rebuilding and reloading after the defense lost Richard Sherman, Cliff Averill, Earl Thomas, all of those other guys. And a couple of years later, they're still young and they're still there. They're still right there. Is Pete Carroll capable of getting this team back to the mountaintop?
He's capable of keeping them within striking distance of it.
Yes, they're in striking distance, right? Like they're in the group of 8 or 10 teams, but they're not in the group of 3 or 4.
And I don't know that he's some singularity as a head coach on the field, a massive difference maker in games. I feel like
agree with you. Game strategy is probably not the thing I think he does best.
And there's always going to be an element of him being thought of more as the culture guy as opposed to the strategy guy. And culture hasn't been the problem the last 2 years. You could argue that execution and crispness has not necessarily been there, and I just based that off of the delay of games that make me want to throw a TV remote through a wall. So I think he's capable, but I don't think he's any more capable than the other coaches, and I think we could have said that about him a couple of years ago, that Pete Carroll versus insert coach X, you're going to take Pete over probably 95% of the coaches in the league. Where now, I don't think you can say that he is someone that you're going to pick over just about every single other option.
I think he's the best bet for keeping your franchise relevant, keeping it competitive. I don't know if he's the best bet right now for getting your team over the hump. And maybe that's a middling difference and it doesn't really matter, but I think there is something about that idea, and it gets into shelf life and what you're capable of building. Marty Schottenheimer, for decades, had the reputation of, if you need a guy that'll get you 9-7, 10-6, 11-5, he's your man. He's not the best guy for playoffs. And some of that had to do with his strategy and playing things closer to the vest. But that's how his coaching career played out. Now, Pete Carroll is pretty much... He's a very different coach than Marty Schottenheimer. And as much as people would sort of point to the similarities in wanting to run the ball, he's a different coach. Pete he likes an aggressive passing game, hucking it down the field, and he's certainly got he knows what culture works for his teams. But I do find myself sitting there wondering, all right, how do you get back? How do you get back to being one of the heavyweights, one of the bullies around the league? And can you do it with a coach who is established and entrenched as Pete is? Because you don't have that sort of buzz of uncertainty, and maybe it's not even complacency in his approach, it's complacency with guys under him. Do coaches have a shelf life in the NFL? I tend to think that maybe they do.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, you can't all coach for 20-plus years with one team. And you might find out if you do 20-plus years with one team, if a player who's been there that exact same time leaves, like you saw with Tom Brady, Bill Belichick, and New England, that all of a sudden it's not quite as easy, it's not quite as automatic. So I do believe that there's a shelf life with all coaches in all sports. I would say in this situation right now, the difference that you're looking for, Danny, they have to figure it out. They have to start doing something that makes teams react, I think.
When you say they, do you mean the players or do you mean the coaches?
The coaches, right? I mean, his cover 3, simple defense with that Legion of Boom made a bunch of teams try to copy it, essentially, after the fact. Everyone was trying to make their own version of it. And they've been running some variant of it ever since then. But this isn't something that is so difficult to beat anymore. And maybe that's because the players aren't the same. I would argue that's probably the strongest reason for that. But what else is it that they are doing that is making other teams across the NFL either react or try to copy, imitate them? And right now, they are trying to imitate what you're seeing with some of the offenses in the division in San Francisco and in Los Angeles. That's why they brought in Shane Waldron.
That part. See, I agree with that on offense. I like their defense. I don't have any issues with the defense that they run. I don't have, and anybody who's looking for them to scheme it up or those sort of things. Look, I think Pete's approach, Pete knows that defense inside and out, And it frees up, the whole idea is to free up defenders to make plays. Let them play. If I had one opinion or one complaint, play more young guys. Let them go out there and cause some havoc. Play more young guys.
I don't have a problem with this scheme necessarily. What I'm just saying is that Pete Carroll doesn't do necessarily anything differently as a X's and O's guy than any other team across the league. And that's not necessarily the end of the world. It's just something that is kind of a strike against him when we're talking about the strategy guy versus the culture guy.
I like that. I like the fact that he knows that defense inside and out. And the reason I like it is because he knows whatever an opponent will do to attack it. He knows however you're going to. And for all that we talk about, you can only fool people for so long with the defense in the NFL. And when you have a really complicated defense, that runs the risk you're going to confuse your guys. I like the fact that he knows that defense. It's his defense. And he's able to react to whatever opponents are going to try to do. Because to exploit one thing, you're leaving yourself vulnerable in another way. He knows how to fix his defense based on how teams attack him.
Is the personnel, though, good enough on that defense to, I would say, fix whatever attack might come against them? And
it's not the dominant defense they had, and it probably won't ever be again. And that's probably why I start to look over to the offense. If you get an average defense, you should be able to win when you've got one of the best quarterbacks in the league, right? You get an average defense, you should be able to win if you have one of the best quarterbacks in the league. But that requires having a little bit of an edge on their offense. And I do think that bringing in Waldron was a good idea for it.
I do too. In the regular season, yeah, you should be able to win with Russell Wilson and a average defense. I don't know if that's necessarily the same in the playoffs. Easy to point the finger at the offense for the struggles down the second half of the season because it was every single game. But the defense did have some issues in that game against L.A. I mean, they were going up against Jared Goff and John Wolford.
They lost that game because of the offense.
They did,
right?
But the defense was a factor.
They lost that game because of the offense.
True, but I mean, you know, for all of the hullabaloo about the season-ending injury to Cam Akers, which was horrible, like I don't find him special as a running back. I feel like he's above average to good. I looked at that team. That should have been, I would imagine, much more one-dimensional and easier to stop in that game, given the limitations that they had at quarterback, and yet there was Cam Akers running all over them. So that is something that I would look at and say that it was a factor.
They lost that game because of the offense.
Not disagreeing. I'm just saying the defense was more of a factor than people are making it out to be in that game.
When I look at Pete and that question of how does he get the team back to the top, what I think of is in 2013, they had this no excuses, provide no reason for doubt. There was a mission that group of players was on. And I'm wondering if it has to be the group of players who have that mission and not necessarily the coaches. I don't think Pete coaches differently than he did. I don't think he has more urgency then compared to now or anything like that. But I haven't seen that same level, that same edge from this team. And I wonder if it's some of the guys in the locker room being used to and accustomed to Pete. It's not a criticism of Pete. But it's wondering if, after a certain amount of time, can you get that team to play with that edge again?
Maybe that made them more willing to give up 2 first-round picks for Jamal Adams, because that's a guy that you watch on the field always seems to have one. It's why I think DJ Reed has been a success story to this point. Those are 2 guys that I feel like you watch them play, and they play with just a different attitude about them. But that's not reflective of the entire defense. I don't think that is just about everybody out there.
Is he signed yet?
Jamal?
Is he signed? Yeah. Is that all taken care of, or are we just hoping? Are we just sitting on our hands
waiting
and hoping? We're hoping that's going to be fine? Because I agree with you. I think they did go out and get him to get that edge. Is he signed yet?
He is out there, and he is being quite the cheerleader, so it is not as if he is angry or annoyed or anything like that. So I feel like we're
he's
close.
Positive.
Yes.
At least he's happy with you.